Wow, this day is finally here. Really want to thank you all for being here and supporting the preservation of ceremonial stone landscapes. First, Mr. DiMarzo, I did not know that you were related to the Winslows. But since you raised it, I will make one clarification. The elder Winslow, who historically we know went to Massasoit. Massasoit was alleged to have been dying, and he gave him some assistance that brought him back to health. That was a very, very important deed. It also launched, in its repercussions, a very serious sequence of events. He wrote a letter, Winslow, saying that these people do not have a devil or a hell. And without a devil or a hell, we can't Christianize them. And so they began the process of initiating for us a devil. And they chose Hobomok, and they pinned that title on the spirit energy known as Hobomok. In other places, and I'll choose one in particular, Massachusetts, in the Deerfield area, there is a place that is referred to as the Turtle. And the oral history is that there was an ancient turtle, huge, that lived in what became known as Lake Hitchcock, which was a glacial lake. And supposedly this turtle, wrong animal, beaver, the giant beaver, began consuming all the fish in glacial Lake Hitchcock. And once had consumed all the fish, this giant beaver then began to consume the people. And so we are told that the people prayed to Hobomok and asked Hobomok to come and resolve this issue. We take away from that, because Hobomok in fact did come and with a large tree broke the neck of the giant beaver that settled to the bottom of Lake Hitchcock and was found eons later as a petrified beaver. But we conclude that the Hobomok, as known by those people, was a great balancer, that Hobomok was called on to bring things back into balance. We find up in that same area a few hills that are known to be the places of Hobomok, because in the winter, warm air came up from the fissures in this particular hill, and it was presumed that since Hobomok was the devil, that was coming from Hobomok's devilish lair. Edward Winslow gave us Hobomok as the devil and gave us a hell. And I've encountered that in going across the United States in other Indian traditions. I have served for several years now as a member of the Historic Landmarks Commission in Washington, D.C., and we had a site that came before us that was an archaeological site known since the 1930s as, it was Hell's something or other, Hell's Gap. And so I asked in my innocent, indigenous way, how did it get the name? Oh, well, it's always been known as that. I said, well, who knew it as that? They said, well, it's just always been known as that. I said, well, we need to find out who, because I don't think it's indigenous people. I said, have you consulted with tribes? Now, they were offering this archaeological site as a historic landmark. And I said, before we designate its name, I'd like to see some consultation with the regional tribes. If, in fact, they support it as that, I'll have nothing to say because I'm not from that region. I said, but I know for a fact that we did not have a hell, so we would not have had a Hell's Gap. And we did not have a devil. It's not a part of our tradition. And one of the PhDs sitting on the panel with me said, are you serious? You didn't have a hell and you didn't have a devil? I said, yes, I'm serious. I know when the determination was made that we would have a hell and a devil, and it was made by Edward Winslow. And he made it once he found out that we did not have those, and we could not be Christianized if we did not have them. So, at any rate, that was the little story I wanted to share with you about himself, Edward Winslow. We thank him so very much. We would have done quite well without a devil or hell, but now we have it and we're stuck with it.
That makes my debt twice as large.
But you know what? Truth crushed to earth shall rise again. And it rises through the hearts and the efforts of good people. And so we can address these issues now because you, with a good heart, are willing to step forward and make amends for any harm that may have been caused by your ancestor. And I deeply, deeply respect and applaud that. Now, I hadn't planned to go down that path, but since you opened it up, it was appropriate. Anybody have any questions about that before I go on? So you all thought that we had a devil, and okay, sorry about that. Sorry to burst that bubble for you. Often we say that this was the Garden of Eden, and it wasn't until people who knew hell, and we respect the fact that your ancestors went through 2,000 years, 2,000 years of trauma that created many of the belief systems that you arrived here with. And we have ultimately joined you in the hell that you brought as baggage. And that must be that we all have a task ahead of us. And it has to do with how we transform this place that was provided for us by our Mother, the Earth. Now, the Earth is not alone. The Earth, in our tradition, has many relatives, many celestial relatives. And one of the beliefs that we have is that some of those ceremonial stone features are prayers that speak to her relatives. So some of them you will see are aligned with particular directions. And in some instances, we have been able to decipher that those alignments are toward celestial fixtures or features that would have been known to our ancestors, and there would have been an understanding of the kind of balance and harmony that they participated in with our Mother, the Earth. These are all her relatives. And just because we've lost knowledge doesn't mean that our ancients did not have knowledge. Letting the landscape speak for itself. The story behind the use of that term came from when I was the lowly field representative up at Turner Falls, Montague, Massachusetts, on a project with the Federal Aviation Administration. And we were actually involved in dealing with an archaeological site that was going to potentially be impacted by the extension of a runway. I played all my cards. All the knowledge I had we weren't going to be able to save sites. We were doing archaeology with a Paleolithic site that a man who was an amateur archaeologist had found and had discovered many Paleolithic artifacts. And since it was known to exist, the airport felt it was appropriate to do archaeology just to see its extent and to try to save it. In dealing with it, came down upon a hearth, and there were elements in that hearth that said to me that on the other side of the runway, on a slope, there was something else. I didn't know what it would be. I went over and started trying to investigate, and I began to find under the leaves discrete piles of stone, but they were at ground level. So I brought the archaeologists over. I said, we've got features over here. And they said, no. I said, we know about that. That's a part of that stone wall that runs down across the hill. I said, oh? I said, well, show me the stone wall. We went to see the stone wall, and it was, by my terminology, a stone row, and it had a break in it. And that break had an oval stone at the either inside of the break, and then off center of the line of the stones, there was another stone, and that created a triangle. So I'm taught to see differently than the archaeologists are taught to see. I didn't go to the academy. I didn't get my instructions from a PhD who I wanted to be like. I got my instructions from tribal elders. And so if I see elements that point to a triangle, it's telling me that it's something important. And so I submitted that information to a man who was working with us, who was an astronomer. And he said, well, if you stand on the base of that triangle, looking at the work that we had done with maps, 15.5 miles away is Mount Pocumtuck. And at Mount Pocumtuck, during August 11th and 12th, the sun will set in a notch on Mount Pocumtuck. I said, oh, okay, great. At that point in my learning, I did not yet know how to interpret what I was being told. But this is where I went with it. I came back to the elder medicine man, and I said, I'm learning some things, but there's no way we're going to be able to convince these people in the federal government to protect this site. What he said to me was, do not rely on our oral history or our tribal lore, because they will find ways to undercut it. Let the landscape speak for itself. I left his office knowing that I had the answer. Let the landscape speak for itself. It only took me 3 days to figure. I did not know what the hell he was talking about. But it was within a month that I get a call from a lady who was local, and she said, ever since I was 8 years old, I've been carried into the woods to look at these Indian sites. And I now have a map with at least 80 of them. Would that be able to help you all in the work that you're doing? Well, we were putting together an oral history of the area and why we felt this particular hill was ceremonial.
Right under the electron.
What we ultimately found was that by letting the landscape speak for itself, by acquiring her list, we were able to then begin to embark on a mapping approach that we began to use at other places. And we began to understand what it meant to let the landscape speak for itself. If the landscape has a series of stones that are in a line, that is an alignment toward something. It may be towards something else in the topography, or it may be towards something above the topography. And what we began to identify time and time again, after we learned how to let the landscape speak for itself, was that we would often find once an alignment that was culturally interesting. We'd say, okay, well, that's an anomaly. If we find it twice, we then consider it a cultural anomaly. If we find it 3 times, it's cultural. And after that, we start looking for it in other places. And what we then began to see was just how many times the ancestors were making the same statement over and over again. Out of that, we began to develop what we ultimately, in 2015, took to the National Register. And this was the 4 tribes that were mentioned before: Mohegan, Pequot, Wampanoag tribe of Gay-Head-Aquina, and the Narragansett. We submitted to the National Register, with the help of some of the workers who worked with us in developing our mapping approach, we submitted a multiple property listing to the National Register. That multiple property listing is now the target for which we are attempting to have at least 5 states shoot for that target in presenting ceremonial stone landscapes. And so with that multiple property listing, we have devised an approach so that ceremonial stone landscapes in this community and in other communities can end up on the National Register, certified by the National Register as indigenous ceremonial stone landscapes. That is the title, the category that will be added to the National Register: indigenous ceremonial stone landscapes. If we could go to the first picture. I needed to give you that background because now I can go through the rest of this quickly. This we already read. Well, how many of you were up at the site in the woods when I spoke earlier? Oh, okay, so you will have, for thousands of years before the immigration of Europeans, the Powwows, or medicine people of today's New England region, used this sacred landscape to sustain the people's reliance on Mother Earth and the spirit energies of balance and harmony. That's the core of what tribal people believe. That's the core of what we never spoke about. And it was decided that through the United South and Eastern Tribes, at that point it was 24 federally recognized tribes who were members, now they're 26, where tribes come together and decide how to approach issues at the federal level. And one of the decisions that was made was that we would create this resolution to take ceremonial stone landscapes out of the realm of confidentiality and begin the process of opening dialogue with communities like yours. Are we soon to have to turn this over to the horses?
15 minutes.
Okay, then I'll make it quick.
This is go back?
Just for a moment. The last line, USET Board of Directors supports the efforts of the member tribes to partner with the pertinent towns and call upon the towns to join the tribes in preservation of this unique and irreplaceable Indian resource. Where we've gone is where we are now. We've come to Hopkinton, and we've asked Hopkinton, join with us, sign with us a co-created memorandum of understanding so that you can protect what is important to us in your jurisdiction. And that's what's happening. And we're starting to do that all over Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and we're headed into New York and into Pennsylvania. We're looking to get all of the states east of the Mississippi involved in our approach toward the multiple property listing, which has as its base the Memorandum of Understanding. Next, please. This is a Manatu Hasanash. This is a stone grouping. Why don't we call them cairns? Cairns is not the language of this place. It is the language of, I believe, the people in Scotland. And for them to call it cairns is totally appropriate. You're not in Scotland anymore. Here, under the language of what the anthropologists would call the Algonquin speakers, or for us, the Inishkitampawag, the appropriate term would be, for a stone grouping, Hasanash, stones, multiple. The stones are spirit stones, and the word for spirit is manatu. So we call these manatu hasanash. Hasun is the word for stone, and we wouldn't call it a pile of stones because we believe that the stones are our grandfathers. And if you have grandfathers out in the middle of a field together, you wouldn't call them a pile of grandfathers, or at least in the English that we use, we wouldn't. So we're calling them a group of grandfathers. And in this case, manatu, spirit, hasanash, spirit stones. Next, please. This particular set of stones is on the Narragansett Reservation. And this is stones, or hasun, on hasunash, on a boulder. We've not created a full set of translated terms. We have many. Some of them are in the Narragansett language. Some of them are in the Mohegan language. We were honored to have the Mohegan linguist work with us in developing that. This particular stone grouping is one of multiples that I'll show you. Next, please. This unfortunate stone grouping is in the town of the town of Upton, Massachusetts. It doesn't exist in this form anymore. The landholder got very upset that Indians had the right to say anything about his property, and he was interested in leasing part of the land out for a cell tower site. And we began to consult on the project. So he went out there one Saturday with his backhoe and played golf with these stones. Fortunately, it had been documented prior to that. Next, please. This is in that same property. And here you will see a shadow casting stone. And it may cast shadow by sunlight, or it may cast shadow by moonlight. And we're starting to do the observations to establish whether it was one or the other or both. But those 8 positions are calendar positions, and they were parts of the ancient ceremonial calendar. And when the shadow was cast on one of them, it was time for particular ceremony. Next, please. This is one of many effigy figures, and I'm sure that since some 7 years old kids figured it out, you all got it, it's a turtle. This is down in Killingworth, Connecticut. And there's the head, the carapace across the top. It has 4 paws and a tail. Next, please. This is a serpentine row. And in the further northeast you go, the serpentine head is upright. The further southwest you go, the serpentine head is what they called a viper's head. It's a triangle, and it's flat. In Pennsylvania, serpentine roads have flat viper heads. This particular one is in Massachusetts, What it has that is peculiar to many serpentine rows, and it has a relationship to what is in the sky, it has a space, a niche behind the head, and in that niche, quite often, you will find an orange stone. The lore that is a complement to, the term that is used, the term in this region, we are advised not to speak that term except at certain times of the year, so I won't speak it at this time. But among the Cherokee, they refer to it as uktena. Uktena. And the uktena is a serpentine form on the ground, but it may also be a serpentine form in the constellations. And the uktena is a horned serpent, and the star Antares, for some people, is a jewel in its forehead. For others, it's a jewel in its neck. But the star Antares is that orange stone that we often find in the niche behind the head of a serpentine row. But the interesting thing about that serpent that is in the constellation, it's in the same area as Scorpius, but it also has two horns. So it is a serpentine row. It is the serpent in the sky with two horns and Antares in its throat. Next, please. This is also back at Turner Falls, at the Airport Hill, at the Prayer Hill. Now, the interesting thing about the Prayer Hill was that the State Historic Preservation Officer disagreed with us. Nothing Indian on this site, because that's what the archaeologist told her, nothing Indian on this site. And they did 100 test pits, a matrix of 100 test pits, and found not one artifact. And they said, no artifacts, no Indian significance. We said, you're blind, you're not seeing what's here. These ceremonial stones, that ceremonial stone row, that is Indian significance. The Federal Aviation Administration said, we don't know how to solve this. We're going to send it to Washington, D.C. And it was at that point that I went to the elder medicine man and said, we're not going to win this, because this FAA is going to go to Washington, D.C., and they're going to get behind closed doors and with this thing called the National Register, and our goose is going to be cooked. That was when the elder medicine man said, let the landscape speak for itself. And in letting the landscape speak for itself, this was something else we found. This is a Manitou stone. And this particular Manitou stone is in a human effigy form. Head, shoulders, waist. Anyone not see what I'm talking about there? Okay. Next slide, please. That's another form of Manitou stone. It has what we refer to as shoulders, and it's pointing to the southwest. The southwest for Narragansetts and for many tribes is the direction to Kaltantowit's house. Kaltantowit is the spirit entity that is in the southwest. And it is to Kaltantowit's house, if you die, and when you die, your spirit goes to the west. And if you are particularly fortunate, it goes to the sweet spot in the west. And the sweet spot is Kaltantowit's house. It was also from Kaltantowit's fields that Crow brought the seed of the corn, the bean, and the squash. And it was those three that allowed the people of the East to develop an agrarian tradition and cease being hunter-gatherers. So we thank Kaltantowit for many things. Next, please. This is the serpentine row. And there's two oval stones. There's been a scatter of stones since the last time the ceremonial people dealt with it. And that's the one off center. Next slide. This is the triangle. And if you're standing on the base of that triangle, next slide, you're looking at Mount Pecumtuck, 15 and a half miles away, and that's the sun setting August 11th and 12th. interesting thing that we saw in terms of coincidence was that the Narragansett still hold. I agree with you, and I'll make it quick. The Narragansett still hold an August festival that is, well, the colonial count is about 340 years, but we believe it's thousands of years old. And it's now called a harvest festival. But what happens at this time of year when this event is occurring is the highest concentration of the Perseid meteor shower. And that's the meteors coming out of the northeast going into the southwest. And it's our belief that that meteor shower is actually the spirits of deceased people. Some believe it's deceased warriors, some believe it's deceased medicine people, some believe it's just the people in general making their journey into Kadontawood's house. Next slide. The interesting thing we found, though, was that where that sun sets, if you go another 3/4 of a mile along that same alignment, you find these standing stones. And these standing stones are at a place called Heath, and this is Burnt Hill, well known to be a place of ceremony. Next. Well, we can't see it very well here, but these are the Perseid meteor showers coming out of the northeast into the southwest. And the Perseid meteor shower flows for a month, but the highest concentration is at the time around the 11th and the 12th. And I've spent many a night praying that the mist would not come in before we got a chance to see the Perseids. And on a few occasions, I've been fortunate. Next slide. This is on the Narragansett Reservation, and as some of you know, we now have a health center. And when they began to develop the health center, fortunately 2 years before, we had mapped the ceremonial stones on the reservation. This we did not find, next slide. We did not find this until we started doing excavation for the landscaping that was going to be done. And what was originally visible was just that. You can see the lichen growth. I'll make it quick. You can see the lichen growth there, and that's all we could see. We excavated down, and what we revealed was an observer's seat, a sky watcher's observer's seat. Next slide. And this was all of what it was seeing. That is the center point. That's where the seat is. We had a major problem, though, where they wanted to put the footprint of that building, the new health center, was going to block several of the alignments. So it was my task to put together a position paper and submit it to the tribal chief, Matthew Thomas. And it was submitted to him, and it was submitted to the medicine man. And what they arrived at, and I pleaded for, was that if, in fact, this building goes where you want it to go, the youth of the tribe will not be able to utilize this ceremonial landscape to learn astronomy and geometry from what was left behind by their ancestors. It took less than a week for the letter to come back. Don't worry, even if we have to lose this grant, we're not going to break up the opportunity for the young people to learn from their ancestors. And amen to the Narragansett hierarchy. If we had lost that battle, I couldn't show my face in public. Next slide. That is the new health center. And these are young people in the tribe who are sitting and attempting to learn more about the geometry and the astronomy of the site that the ancients left behind. Next slide. This is a split boulder, but a side split boulder. And it's one of the alignments that you see from that seat. Next. This is another feature on the reservation. This was a signal rock, and I'm hurrying. The signal rock, and you'll find these all along the coast, and it's our belief that not through the air, but through the bedrock, you could tip these and send a signal through the bedrock to the next signaling station. And so they could communicate in ancient times utilizing that methodology. Sometimes it was just to let people know that a runner was coming through and he shouldn't be disturbed, shouldn't be bothered. But it was the way of communicating from one community to another. Next. This is a hasanek. Now, you've all heard the word horseneck. Horseneck beach, horseneck this, horseneck that. I used to look at that word and try to figure out where's the horse. I'd look at the map. I couldn't see anything that looked like a horse's neck. And then in our team, we finally arrived at, wait a minute. This is actually a stone cave. And the words for stone cave are hasun, just like hasanash, but hasanek, a stone cave. And so this particular hasanek is in Upton, Massachusetts. It has been protected and preserved by the town, and it looks out onto a ceremonial stone landscape that is now in the ownership of the Narragansett Tribal Historic Preservation Trust. There's a young lady right over there who's one of the caretakers. Kathy, wave. She's one of the caretakers of that site. Next slide. That's an interior view of that particular hasanek. Next slide. That is a different type of hasanek. It's that's in North Smithfield, Rhode Island. Next. This is also in North Smithfield, Rhode Island. And these are two things. They both are shadow casting figures. And that base is only about 1.5 feet wide. So these are relatively small, and how they have survived nature all these years, we don't know, and we're not going to bother trying to find out. But it's our belief that we're looking at an upright bear and a bear on all fours. And what this aligns with, and it creates what we refer to as an artificial horizon. The back of that bear, if you go to the next slide, please. If you're sitting in this seat, you are looking at those two bears, and the alignment from that seat aligns with the bear constellation, or what we refer to as the Big Dipper. And we have found this alignment. We found one on the reservation, an alignment at this particular direction that is looking at the Big Dipper, and we believe that it has, if we go back to Roger Williams, he tells us that the word in Narragansett for bear is mosque, or it is pakonawa. And if you decipher that, you have pa-wa at the beginning and the end of the word, which is medicine person. And in the middle of the word, you have kunum, which is the word for a ladle or a spoon. So it is a medicine person's ladle or spoon. And if it's associated with bear, we're raising questions about whether or not the medicinal observations of the actions of a bear, that was one of the ways of knowing what was good medicine, what wouldn't harm you, if you monitored what the bear was eating. But the other thing was, we believed that they made prayer at that time to ask for guidance to service their patients. So if you needed to know how to cure an ailment, you might it might be associated with this process. Do we know that for fact? Not yet. We haven't had a medicine person who's come forward and said, well, you got that one right. We are looking toward some of our medicine people who are further north, where the star tradition is still very active, up beyond Quebec. Next. This is a simulation, but you'll see the bear. The dipper, and what we find is that at the time of the equinox, the fall equinox, the handle, the stars in the handle of that dipper rise at dawn. And so they rise above that artificial horizon line. And so we're still studying that. We're still in the process. And you may have one here on this reservation, or this preserve. Next. This effigy figure was amazing. We found this, and we find them in many forms, but this is a whale. And it's a whale effigy that's probably more than 50 miles from the ocean. It's down in West Danbury, Connecticut. The possibility that it is honoring whale, or the possibility that it's honoring whale who may have been inland, we don't know. But it is an effigy that we were able to identify, and it is protected. Next. You've met this character before, but yes, this is my last. These are in Pennsylvania, and that form is seen all over the woods of Pennsylvania. And that is a ceremonial, that is a Manatuhasanash in a form that we find in that area and that we were able to protect. I thank you very much. Any questions? Wanted to make National Historic Preservation Act can still be found at 36 CFR Part 800. 36 CFR Part 800.4 C1 informs the reader that Indian tribes possess special expertise in assessing the eligibility of properties for the National Register. And we are utilizing that as a part of what we are doing with towns and with the National Register to come forward with that expertise. And we're looking forward to sharing that with more towns in the form of our memorandums of understanding and with good people who are already devoting their time to mapping. We want to share with you some of the approaches the subtleties that we've added to the mapping process that will help gear projects toward the National Register. So thank you very much for the work you're putting in. And we're giving thanks for all things, even Edward Winslow.